Welcome to my talk on the evolution of incident management at Slack. My name is Brent Chapman, and I'm a staff engineer at Slack in our reliability pillar with a focus on incident management. First, a little history. Slack was started in late 2013 from the ashes of a beautiful but unsuccessful online multiplayer game called Glitch. By 2015, it was adding tens of thousands of new active users each week. By 2017, it had become a darling of the tech world with many teams and users depending on it, but it was straining to keep up with this exponential growth. When it went down, people noticed, and it went down a lot. By June of 2018, as more and more teams came to depend on Slack, these outages were becoming more and more of a concern for both current and potential future customers, and therefore for the company. So Slack announced that it was establishing a safety engineering team and started recruiting for that team. I was hired on to that newly formed team in October of 2018 to help build Slack's incident management capability. I had previously worked as an SRE at Google and had developed and evangelized Google's own incident management protocols known as IMAG, which somewhat unimaginatively stands for Incident Management at Google. I based IMAG on my own experiences with the public safety world's incident command system, or ICS, which I had learned as an air search and rescue pilot and incident commander, and later as a member and instructor in community emergency response team programs in several cities, including Mountain View, San Francisco, and Alameda. Over the years, I have given several talks to various audiences, including USENIX, LISA, and SRE conferences, about lessons that we in the IT world could learn about incident management from folks who manage emergencies every day, namely public safety agencies such as fire departments. After leaving Google, I built a consulting business helping companies develop and strengthen their own incident management practices using these principles. And eventually, Slack recruited me to join them full-time in order to build their incident management program. Just before I started, though, Slack suffers what's known internally as the reliability crisis. In September 2018, Slack suffered a series of very visible, very painful outages. Most of them were self-induced due to Slack's somewhat loose software build and deployment methods at the time. At that time, every engineer was responsible for merging their code into the main line, building a release, and pushing that release out to production. This happened dozens of times a day, and there were only loose and informal coordination between the engineers. There were no blocking tests, there were no canaries, there were no dog food environments. Everything rolled out to all servers simultaneously and roughly instantaneously. The reliability crisis caused Slack to stop all deployments for several weeks while we regrouped and retooled and started developing a set of tools and processes for more orderly, controlled testing and deployment of our software. Among other things, we established the notion of a deploy commander, which was a rotating position amongst our software engineers. The deploy commander would conduct the official merge, build a release, and roll out the release in a phased manner, complete with dog food and canary phases. Each deploy goes first to dog food, which consists of servers serving two of Slack's own workspaces, our engineering workspace and our social workspace. The idea is if there are problems with the release, we'll experience those problems ourselves first before customers do. The deploy commander watches the release in dog food for a few minutes, checking graphs and dashboards and error logs to verify that everything seems to be working as expected, and then goes on to the canary phase, which is 1% of our servers. They spend another few minutes checking everything there and then move on to repeat that process at 10%, 25, 50, 75, and finally 100% of our servers in turn. So it takes a few minutes for each of those phases, takes about an hour to get a release totally out the door. If all goes well, they do that, and then they start the next release. If we run into a problem at any point, we roll back and regroup. We do this now about a dozen times a day, and that keeps our development and deployment velocity up. Another thing that came out of the reliability crisis was Slack's notion of service ownership. Service ownership amounted to dismantling our old ops team and pushing responsibility for operating the various services that make up Slack back onto the teams that develop those services. In other words, a modern DevOps, you build it, you run it model, rather than an old-fashioned, you build it and throw it over the wall to ops model. The tail of that service ownership transition is a whole nother talk, which Holly Allen and others have presented in various forums. If you're interested in hearing more about it, check out those talks. Finally, the reliability crisis gave Slack the clear message that it needed to build and strengthen its incident management capabilities, and that's where I came in. We view incident management as having three parts. First, incident response, which is what you do when there's an emergency during the emergency. Second, incident review, which is what you do after the emergency to understand what happened and how we responded and how we can avoid the problem in the future or respond better if that or a similar problem happens again. And then finally, incident analysis, which is looking across sets of incidents to find common threads, common factors, and so forth. Our first step in building an incident management program was to build support for that program throughout the company. And we did that by developing a vision and plan document that we could share, discuss, debate, and get folks on board with. The first part of our vision was that incident management would be recognized as a key capability for the company, something that we needed to invest in and couldn't simply buy or outsource and could not afford to ignore. Second, our vision was that incident management practices would be consistent across the company so that no matter what sort of incident we were dealing with or which teams were involved, folks would understand the process and the tools and the terminology and so forth. This was one of the big lessons from fire departments that led to the creation of the incident command system back in the late 1960s and early 70s. Third, we envisioned incident management capabilities at all levels within the organization. Incident management wasn't going to be something that only a handful of specialists got involved with. It was going to be something that everybody was involved with, at least at some level. Essentially, we were establishing a vision for a volunteer fire department at Slack, where when the alarm bell rang, folks would put aside what they were doing and help deal with the incident rather than wait for somebody else to respond and deal with it. Fourth, we envisioned a set of effective mechanisms for developing and strengthening those incident management capabilities. We knew that this wasn't something that we could simply buy a piece of software to do, but rather that it was a set of skills and capabilities that we were going to have to develop and nurture ourselves and keep nurturing over time. Finally, we envisioned that we would create a blameless or blame-aware incident review culture so that we could learn everything we could from our incidents to either keep them from happening again or to better respond if they did. This was our vision. Okay, so what was our plan for achieving that vision? First, we wanted to build an awareness level of incident management throughout the engineering organization by including it in our new hire onboarding process. Second, we wanted all engineers to be trained and prepared to operate as responders during incidents by putting them through a 3-hour training course. Most new hires take this class about a month or so after they join Slack as part of their onboarding process. They've been with the company long enough to have their feet under them, to know something about our technology and our organizational structure, and maybe even to have seen some incidents on their team. Even folks who have previous experience as incident responders elsewhere take this class so that they can learn what our standards and practices and tools and terminology are. Third, we wanted further training for people who would be incident commanders or acting in other leadership roles within our incidents. Fourth, we wanted to develop abbreviated refresher training for experienced incident responders and leaders, and to keep people sharp over time. Finally, we wanted to develop and conduct exercises to help folks practice and sharpen their incident management skills. How did we do? What parts of the plan did we actually end up doing? Well, the awareness training turned out to be unnecessary. Most folks already had what we considered to be sufficient incident awareness, and those that didn't picked it up pretty quickly through osmosis. Our incident responder and incident commander classes, which are each 3 hours, have been the bread and butter of our program. They've been very successful. We intended to put everyone in engineering through the incident responder course, and we've essentially achieved that. As I mentioned earlier, new hires go through it shortly after joining, and we caught all the existing engineers by including the incident responder class in the training we did for all engineering teams, team by team, as part of the service ownership transition. For the incident commander class, we set a goal of training 15% of our folks as incident commanders, and we have wildly exceeded that. Last time I checked, we were at more like 25%. In particular, we've trained about 3/4 of our engineering managers and directors as incident commanders, which means that we have excellent management understanding of and support for the program. The refresher training hasn't been necessary. For good or bad, we have enough incidents that everybody gets enough practice with real incidents. And finally, we did develop and conduct an incident management exercise that was fairly effective and fairly popular, but it didn't survive the pandemic. The exercise by its nature needs to be done in person as a group, and it does not translate well to Zoom. So we have been trying to figure out an alternate exercise that's more Zoom friendly, but we haven't really come up with anything yet. If you've got one, we'd love to hear about it. I mentioned our incident management training program. We have 2 3-hour classes, one for all responders, which is essentially everyone in engineering, and another that builds on that for incident commanders. Both of these classes are based on PagerDuty's class, which they were good enough to release as open source and to make available at response.pagerduty.com. As I mentioned, all of our new hire engineers take the incident responder class shortly after they join the company, and we put all of our existing engineers through it as part of the service ownership transition. After a few months of experience, and if they're interested, folks come back and take the incident commander class. Like I said, we were aiming to get about 15% of our folks trained as incident commanders, and we've blown past that and achieved about 25%. It is strongly encouraged, almost mandatory, for engineering managers and directors, but the class is open to all levels of individual contributors as well. And some of our most junior engineers have become some of our most capable incident commanders. Once we had everybody sold on the vision and plan, we had to start and had started training folks. Our next step was to develop a standardized set of severity levels. Our severity levels guide helps incident commanders determine what severity level is appropriate for a given incident, and then helps everyone else understand what sort of response is expected at that severity level. In particular, is this incident a SEV 3 that we're only expecting to work normal business days and hours on? Or is it a SEV 2 that we're going to work extended hours on, starting early and staying late? Or is it a SEV 1 that we're going to work around the clock on? Our severity levels are guidelines for the incident commander, not a straitjacket. They're not prescriptive. They're intended to inform and shape the judgment of the incident commander, but in the end, the severity level of a given incident is a judgment call. I could do a whole nother talk about severity levels, how to shape them, how to use them, and so forth. The next thing we did in establishing our incident management program was create an on-call rotation of incident commanders who could lead incident responses company-wide. We call this Major IC. Major IC has someone somewhere in the world on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We use a follow the sun staffing model during the week. So each person is on call roughly during their normal workday before handing the pager to their next colleague around the globe. Initially, we had folks in San Francisco, Melbourne, Australia, and Dublin, Ireland, and we have since added colleagues in Pune, India, and on the US East Coast. The weekend shift covers the entire weekend from 4 p.m. Friday San Francisco time until 4 p.m. Sunday, when it's Monday morning in Melbourne, and they pick up the pager. This isn't too burdensome though, as we get very few incidents on weekends. Much of the ongoing evolution of our incident management program can be seen through a lens of a series of challenges that have arisen with Major IC and our solutions to those challenges. So let me take you through some of those. The first problem was that there were a lot more trained and qualified folks available for Major IC in the San Francisco office where Slack is headquartered than in Melbourne or Dublin. For almost everyone, Major IC on-call is in addition to whatever on-call schedule they're on for their home team, for their primary team. Both Melbourne and Dublin were home to small teams of engineers, and so those engineers each spent proportionally more time on call for Major IC than folks in the San Francisco office did. At the beginning, we had 10 or so people available in San Francisco for Major IC, but only 4 or 5 people in each of Melbourne and Dublin who could serve in Major IC. And those folks were pretty much voluntold that they were going to be doing Major IC rather than volunteering for it as folks in San Francisco did, where they were 10 out of several hundred engineers. This meant that Major IC on-call was a bigger burden for each of those engineers in Melbourne and Dublin compared to their colleagues in San Francisco. And again, they were also still on call for their primary teams as well. We addressed this as best we could in a variety of ways. First, we relieved Melbourne and Dublin from handling weekend on-call for major IC. We handle all of the weekends out of folks in San Francisco. Since we started with 10 people in major IC in San Francisco, that meant that each person was on call for 1 weekend out of 10, which is a manageable burden. We're now up to 15 people in major IC in San Francisco, so the burden is even less. Second, over time, we grew the teams in both Melbourne and Dublin so that the on-call load was simply spread out over more people. And finally, we reduced the hours of on-call during each day for both Melbourne and Dublin by adding engineers from our Pune, India office to the major IC on-call rotation as we established and staffed up our teams there in India. Another problem was major IC is a lot of responsibility to shoulder, especially for a junior or mid-level engineer. Some of our folks were very nervous about being handed the keys to the kingdom and being expected and empowered to be the incident commander for all of Slack if there was some major incident or outage. We addressed this by making sure that we had both strong and vocal support for major IC from our engineering management and executive teams. Both by word and by action, the management and executives showed that they would back up the judgment of the on-call major IC to keep Slack up and running. We also established strong peer support from fellow major IC members around the world. We made sure that folks had a safe space where they felt comfortable raising their concerns, discussing them with peers, and getting support and suggestions. Finally, we established a mechanism called the BAT signal for each of our 4 regions worldwide, that is San Francisco, Melbourne, Pune, and Dublin, that folks are encouraged to activate if they feel like they need help. The BAT signal for each region pages all of the members of the major IC rotation for that region who respond on a best effort basis. It also pages all of the members of the prior region in the follow the sun rotation under the theory that it's evening where they are and they're likely to be still awake. Again, nobody is obligated to respond to the BAT signal, but it's a way to quickly ask your colleagues for help when you need it. And our company culture is such that you're likely to have several who respond to help when it's requested. Another challenge was that there's a lot of work for the incident commander to do, particularly in a major incident, and a lot of things competing for their attention. So it's easy to lose track of things and forget to do certain things. We addressed this in 2 ways. First, we established and maintain an incident commander checklist, which serves as a reminder and quick reference card. And by the way, if you've never read Dr. Atul Gawanda's book, The Checklist Manifesto, I highly recommend it. Dr. Gawanda is a surgeon and professor at Harvard Medical School and has worked extensively on the use of checklists in high stress and safety critical environments such as emergency medicine, surgery, and aviation. It's a quick read, and like I said, I highly recommend it. Second, we built an incident bot to automate many of our incident processes and practices. The incident bot acts as the incident commander's assistant in managing the incident, handles a lot of the administrative work of managing the incident channel. Our bot is not available as open source, unfortunately, because it's too tied to our internal environment. But there are several similar bots that are available from folks such as Netflix and Monzo Bank, as well as a variety of commercial products and services in this space. As we continued to grow and as we used our incident response processes more and more, our next problem was handling simultaneous incidents. We started getting to the point where it was common to have 2, 3, or more incidents going on simultaneously. And with only one major IC on call, that was a problem. We did a little analysis and discovered that our busiest hours for incidents were during US weekdays. So we established a second on-call rotation of incident commanders called Slack IC, with the idea that major IC could hand off less severe incidents to Slack IC when needed. We've continued to grow Slack IC to the point where we now have as many as 3 Slack ICs on call simultaneously during certain especially busy hours of the week. As a side benefit, we also found that the Slack IC rotation gave newer incident commanders a place to gain experience and build their confidence before joining major IC. The most common path to joining major IC now includes spending some time working incidents in Slack IC before, quote, moving up to the big leagues. Slack IC also gave us a way to staff the incident commander role for multiple simultaneous incidents, but those incidents sometimes ended up in contention for key resources, such as deploy slots or sometimes even key individual engineers. Normally, if there were only a couple of simultaneous incidents, the incident commanders involved can work out any resource contention among themselves, particularly if the incidents happen to be at different sub-levels. However, sometimes the situation is more complicated and somebody needs to referee. In order to address this contention when it occurred, we established something called Area Command. Area Command is another mechanism drawn from the public safety world's incident command system. The basic idea with Area Command is that you have a meta incident overseeing all of the other incidents and prioritizing and arbitrating and delegating resources between them. Area commanders are our most experienced incident commanders. When we activate Area Command, singleton resources such as the deploy commander or our exec team liaison move up to the Area Command incident. We end up activating Area Command only a couple of times a year, and usually only for a couple of hours until the resource contention works itself out, but it has proven invaluable when we have used it. Another problem that we face is how to staff the incident commander role for long duration incidents, or the long tail of our incidents. Most of our incidents are resolved within a couple of hours. The last time I ran the numbers, our median incident duration was 124 minutes. And about 2/3 of our incidents were resolved in less than 4 hours. Generally, those incidents can be handled by a single incident commander or with a single handoff from one IC to the next on call in the follow the sun rotation. Staffing the incident commander role for incidents that go on longer than that, though, can be a challenge. We'd rather not staff the IC role for these long-running incidents with on-call incident commanders from major IC, because we want to keep those people available for quick response to new incidents. Our first solution was to start handing those incidents off from major IC to Slack IC, particularly as we grew the number of folks on call simultaneously for Slack IC. That just pushes the problem down a level, though, and you start to run out of capacity in Slack IC. Our current approach to this has been to train all engineering managers as incident commanders, in part so that we can hand long-running incidents off to the engineering manager of the relevant team. Knowing that you're going to need an incident commander in a few hours or tomorrow is a lot different problem from needing an incident commander right now, which is what the on-call IC rotations are intended to address. The in a few hours or tomorrow is more of a team resource management problem with less time sensitivity and thus the domain of the engineering managers. Another problem we faced was a large number of incidents within certain teams or pillars. A pillar, by the way, is Slack's organizational level above a team and is led by a director. Our solution was to start establishing pillar-specific incident commander on-call rotations for those pillars with enough incidents and incidents that tended to be self-contained within the pillar. We've helped these pillars get enough incident commanders trained and help them set up and manage their IC on-call rotations. So far, we've done this with 2 pillars, and we expect to establish more as we continue to grow. So far, I've talked mostly about incident response, but as I explained at the beginning, there are 2 other parts of incident management: incident review and incident analysis. Incident review is looking at an individual incident after the fact and learning everything we can from it. Other companies call this a postmortem, but we've moved away from that terminology because nobody died. We've built our incident review process by first establishing and maintaining a strong, blameless culture. Folks like Will Gallegos and John Allspaw have given great talks on that topic, and I encourage you to check those out. We decided early on that our incident commanders would not be responsible for leading our incident reviews, as that just placed too much of an ongoing time demand on the incident commanders. We expect the incident commanders to be important contributors to the incident review, but the responsibility for establishing and setting up and coordinating and leading the review falls to the engineering manager of the most involved team in the incident response. The last responsibility of the incident commander as they close out an incident is to name the engineering manager who will be responsible for the incident review. This is a no give backs handoff. If that engineering manager wants to delegate that responsibility to someone on their team, or thinks that it should have gone to some other engineering manager, it's up to them to work that out without kicking it back to the incident commander. So how did the pandemic and work from home impact our incident management practices? Surprisingly, not very much. Everyone working from home was no big deal for us since we were already generally working incidents in Slack channels rather than face-to-face. Not being face-to-face didn't really hamper us. In some ways, it has been a benefit for us as our incident commanders have spread out from San Francisco. We used to be heavily concentrated in the Pacific time zone, but now we have incident commanders available in more time zones, at least across the US. Incident response is an intense activity that requires a lot of trust and cooperation to be successful. That in turn relies on social bonds, the so-called soft skills and informal relationships that were, in many cases, spawned and nurtured by casual interactions in the office as we ran into people in the break rooms, the hallways, before meetings, and so forth. We have to consciously work to establish and maintain those social bonds now that we're all working remotely. On the other hand, this has put people that were in remote offices, such as Melbourne, Dublin, Pune, and so forth, on a more even footing with people who were in San Francisco. There's no longer that social benefit to being based in San Francisco. So what's next for our incident management program? Well, we want to continue to build our roster of trained incident commanders. We want to establish additional pillar and team-specific on-call rotations. We want to continue to improve our methods for handling long-running incidents that sometimes go on for multiple days or even multiple weeks in the case of some security incidents that require very detailed investigations. We want to continue developing and strengthening our incident review capabilities. And finally, we want to build on that by evolving an incident analysis practice to learn what we can by looking across multiple incidents rather than just reviewing them individually. What are some of the ongoing challenges that we face? Well, the biggest one is that Slack itself is our key tool for incident response. What do we do when Slack itself is down or so badly degraded that we can't use it ourselves? This happens about once or twice a year. It's very painful for us when it does happen because it deprives us of our key communication and coordination tool. And because it only happens once or twice a year, we don't get much practice in operating without Slack. So we're working on ways to address that. Another ongoing challenge is how do we recruit and train new incident responders and commanders? We've started by making incident response involvement, either as a responder or a commander, an explicit part of our job ladders and promotion expectations. The more senior you are, the bigger a contribution that you're expected to make. A related issue is how do we enable people to practice their incident skills and develop confidence in those skills? Finally, we face the challenge of success. If you have a very successful program such as this one, how do you demonstrate the need for more to support and grow the program when it already appears to be well functioning? How do you ensure that it remains successful? Thank you very much for your time. I'm Brent Chapman, and I'm happy to take your questions either now or later. Feel free to reach out to me via Twitter or email, or if you use Slack, via Slack Connect direct message. And enjoy the rest of the conference.